A comprehensive look at life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the 21st century. The Bailout Hour.
This is the Bailout Hour. I'm William Paul. I'm joined with the infamous Dale Fruit, and I'm going to be introducing Ed Wolf. Welcome, Ed. I'm glad you're here. Dale, this is exciting. Before we kick off today, I want to continue with the general theme. What we've been talking about is the police state and where we've been going with it. But we talked about a concept of war of words previously. And that being the case, I wanted to define what a police officer is. And according to Merriam-Webster, a police officer is a person whose job is to enforce laws, investigate crimes, and make arrests. And he's a member of the police. Okay. Additionally, another term and that is associated with police officer is actually peace officer, and it's more of a traditional term. In fact, POST is called Peace Officers Standard and Training. So that's the actual acronym. It's not Police Officers Standard and Training, it's Peace Officer. And a peace officer is a police officer or similar official and is a civil officer whose duty is to preserve public peace, and that's also according to Webster. And then the last interesting definition that Merriam offers up is for police.
While you're waiting, so your gut, does that tell you, William, that a peace officer is separate from a police officer? Are they one and the same, or is there any conflict between the two? Or is that what we're talking about?
I think that they do sound different. To me, they don't sound the same. I think that a peace officer is more associated with maintaining the peace, and a police officer is enforcing and investigating crime.
Now, different states have different definitions. In some states, the term is law enforcement officer. Some is police officer, some is peace officer. They practically mean the same thing, however.
They do. What is enforcing laws, that's the police officer. Enforcing laws, investigating crimes, and they make arrests. The peace officer is operating usually on behalf of with the citizens' duties, and there to preserve the public peace. So, and I guess in essence, by being able to arrest and enforce laws, they would be able to preserve that peace by definition.
So why? Just to get you back up to speed, why are we discussing that? Ed Wolf is with us today, and we definitely want to be talking about the war of words and definitional things. And this has been going back. This is an ancient issue of people using words and modifying words or deviating from their original definition in order to move forward a specific agenda, and that's been happening forever, and it's certainly no different now. And I think more in current affairs, you're starting to find that people are picking up on that and using that. So if we're talking about the police state, it would behoove the listener to make an active working definition of how do we define that? What is a police officer? What is a peace officer? And we tapping in back to the other show, if that peace officer or law officer is swearing an oath, then how important are those words? Because that is his sworn duty to uphold and defend the Constitution. What are those words? What actually is he defending? Do you know? Does he know? And then a whole nother layer is the legal part of it. What legal obligation does a police officer have to actually execute his duties for an individual or for the people at large? So we're going to be discussing all that today.
I think that the oath of office for law enforcement officers, or whatever term you choose to use, is pretty much standard across the country. I've looked at quite a few different states. And as far as the general public goes, there's not much difference. Most folks think of police, sheriff, cops. All of those terms are completely interchangeable, and I don't think they get into the nuances of what the words perhaps actually mean. So I think the general perception is that the guy who drives a police car and wears a uniform, has a badge, and has a gun, he's the guy we're talking about here, regardless of what title happens to be attached to him.
Well, and I think the reason I'm bringing up what is a peace officer and a police officer is it's important because without meaning behind the words, what do we have? There is a difference between a peace officer and a police officer. There's a difference between law enforcement and policing or as a peace officer. And there's a difference in the mindset. If we're just strictly going to have police officers operate within the realm of law, okay, then we breach back into the concepts which we were talking. If there's a law that's passed, which could be considered unconstitutional, okay, and they're abiding by law because somebody wrote it, they're not thinking, they're not using their discretion, they're just simply enforcing law as robots, then we end up in that complication of, well, if they were a peace officer, they'd be doing it to maintain the peace.
Well, I think that, again, let's go back and look at it from the perspective of the citizen who calls 911 or the person who responds to that call. The citizen really doesn't care. He's got a problem. He's been trained, call 911, and somebody called a police officer or a cop or whatever is going to show up and take care of whatever their problem is. From the other side of it, however, you've raised a completely different issue when it comes to enforcing laws, and are those laws constitutional or not constitutional? Those sorts of things are actually a very hot topic these days. I just saw a news article this morning about a representative from Washington State in Olympia standing on the steps of the Capitol with a whole bunch of armed citizens saying that Washington's new law, the I-594 law, is unconstitutional and therefore is no law. And this particular representative is also an attorney. So what does that mean in terms of the law enforcement officer, the police officer, trying to enforce that particular law? I think that's the question on the
Or
table.
what happens to him when he doesn't?
What happens when he does and what happens when he doesn't?
I'm very familiar with that gentleman. His name is Representative Matt Shea. I think he's out of the 4th District here of the Spokane Valley. And the gentleman, Matt, is very, very well-versed on this topic. And you could, whatever, it's one person's opinion. Well, actually, it's thousands of people's opinions. But I think what his goal is to get that conversation tabled. It's obvious that that's not lawful. There's no doubt about that. The question is, what sheriffs of what counties are going to execute their lawful oath and refuse to enforce unlawful law and to hand out that mandate to their deputies? And if you want to keep peeling that onion back, how many deputies are waiting for their sheriff to say you are not going to enforce that, and do they need to? Because that deputy swore an oath that supersedes any authority that that sheriff has over them. They have an obligation to not enforce unlawful code, which is exactly what that is. But to make this peaceful and to protect everybody, the first thing you have to do is discuss it, because that was actually a not a referendum, but it was an
initiative.
An initiative that was passed, and the legislature, which clearly hasn't read the Constitution either, they just simply sign it into law. So, okay, there it is, law. Now, here's the friction. You've got however many sheriffs are in Washington State, 54, 72, I can't remember how many there are. They're sitting there. Well, and if you ask them specifically, because I have a job to faithfully execute the laws. I totally get that, but that's a cop-out. I need you to tell me if that's legitimate law or not. And it's a sincere conversation that needs to be had. I think Representative Shea is at the tip of the spear in leading that conversation, and I think it causes a lot of discomfort among police, sheriffs, state patrol, a citizen who's engaged, but we need to be having the conversation. That's what we've been doing the last few episodes of the Bailout Hour.
Well, I certainly didn't mean to imply that I disagree with Representative Shea. I absolutely do agree with him, but it raises that ethical issue. First of all, was even the process legal in the initiative being voted on just by majority vote and then just signed by the legislature? That's even a question, is that legal constitutionally? And then on top of that, is the law itself constitutional? So there's two questions here that are very critical. And I don't want to get down into the weeds too much with that. But if we bring it right back to the cop on the street, regardless of what you call him, he has a dilemma, and I think you made a good point, Dale. First of all, he has an oath of office that supersedes his sheriff's potential instructions. The sheriff may say, we're going to enforce or not enforce. And what kind of a dilemma does that put the cop on the street in?
It sounds like we're talking about nullification, right? I mean, if we're talking about this oath to the Constitution and laws get passed, and we're saying, are you to follow those orders? And to say, no, I'm not going to do it. Or if it would be similar to a juror that says, no, not guilty, but the law says that they are guilty according to the law. Okay, so that would be nullification. However, I think the federal courts through the Supremacy Clause would object to that, and I think that's where this conflict is coming in. And I'm just looking here at Wikipedia, and it says nullification, not that Wikipedia is the best source of information, but it's an interesting definition here. Nullification is a legal theory that states have the right to nullify or invalidate federal laws which they view as being unconstitutional. I mean, that's simply it. I mean, that's what we're talking about. But I think that we also, as peace officers and elected officials, I feel that there is an obligation to make sure that, Constitution is being followed.
And that's depending on the specific oath you took. The very first line in some oaths, not all oaths across the states or municipalities are the same, but some of them, okay, and I don't mean to be making this a broad generalization, but I'm going to anyway. I do swear that I will truly serve our sovereign country and state. And I think that breaks out the Sixth Amendment, the 10th Amendment, and everything else of you understand that we as a state have a right to refuse to enforce unconstitutional law. And we've seen that. And we've seen the people that have fought the federal government. It's down in Arizona. It's down in Nevada. You see those specific issues. And I think what happens across mainstream media is, well, those people are just wackos. Well, isn't it? Okay, wackos. So you've marginalized them, and the issue is those people are insane, and it's not even worth discussing. Right. But if you look at a constitutional scholar, for example, Representative Shea, he brings up all of the legal background as to why those issues came to a head where they were and who is actually technically in the right, again, according to his opinion. But that'll never go through federal court because it's dismissed.
Right, and what you're talking about here is we're talking about war of words, okay? And that's why we're talking about this, is because there's some confusion. And I think the confusion comes from there's the intent of the law when it was written. Okay, so the Constitution was written hundreds of years ago, 100 plus years ago. So here we are sitting here looking at this, and we may feel that there's a different intent. But if you research it, you find out the true intent. Then there's a case law, which is then
Can I interrupt you really quick?
And there's written law.
That's true.
So those are the three things that I think that are relevant with public perception, and that's what I'm really just trying to bring up here. But go ahead.
And if the listener's thinking, yeah, well, who's judging what the actual intent actually was? What William Paul just said was, we're going to find out the true intent. And for those of you out there who are saying, well, come on, is there really true intent? If you have read the Federalist Papers, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederacy, if you see the Constitution as an abstract document that's kind of weird and esoteric, I get it. Totally get it. And it can be confusing to try to study that and understand what it really means. But if you just take one Federalist paper and sit down at an evening and read it and look at the debates that our forefathers had, they discuss these words and they run them out to their natural philosophical conclusion. If we did this, what would happen? If we did this, what would happen? And they debated and they fought and they drafted those words very, very carefully. So what you were just saying, you can definitely hear the true intent of what the constitutions were, the amendments to the Constitution. We know the spirit behind that. The question is, when we start talking about codes in today, 2015, if those codes are absolutely contrary to the spirit of that, what's the remedy?
Right. What is the practice? What's the common practice today? And that's going to be based on what courts have found through case law to be the appropriate actions that can be done. And that's why there's this discrepancy that I have previously brought up about just the ability to search a vehicle based on the odor of marijuana. Some states it's legal, other states it's not, through the plain smell doctrine. So why is there a discrepancy upon a Fourth Amendment right across the board on different states. How is that not uniform? And it's because there's district courts, and then it's the case law in those court districts that determine that. And then, of course, and there's the written law, and then that can be left to interpretation. And then when that gets in the muddy area, then that reverts back to case law, and then we actually lose the intent. And this is the other thing that out of the intent, I feel that the case has been that we've become a bit gluttonous as a country, and we've become a little complacent. So we felt, because of our success as a nation as a whole, we've, I guess, reveled in this, in the wealth, which today obviously is no longer the case, but becoming a world power, having the world currency as the U.S. dollar for so many years, and basically we've just felt we can just run free. And so people felt the government couldn't do anything wrong. And that may have been the case at some point, but that was when the people were educated enough about what was going on. And now we've turned to the government to provide so much, provide health care, make sure everybody is on unemployment. If they don't have a job, we'll just keep extending it out. Those are obviously state deals. But government's involved in that. And then it reverts back to the policeman or the peace officer. And it talks about what is their role and what's their expectation? Well, I would say the expectation today is that the peace officer has to come out to your house and settle your stuff and do what you want him to do, because you don't have the skills to do it anymore because you've become a glutton. So you just watch your TV, you get used to not having to do anything. There's no conflict or violence. And if there is and you live in that, then you get to see the policeman more because you call them, okay? Or you're of the other breed, you just handle stuff yourself. So the intent of a lot of laws today, just to sum up real quick, is that we are asking as a populace, not individually, but we've allowed over time by either a lack of action or a request that the government keep us safe. That is why there's gun laws that restrict our Second Amendment, because we asked and allowed it to happen, or we allowed it to happen and did not oppose it. Okay, that's the same thing with local stuff that goes on in your community. And when you find a law, you're like, that doesn't even make sense. Why is that even there? Why is this? That doesn't make any sense.
Well, and I understand that, but that's kind of getting away from where we started. Let's go back to the fundamentals. Now, someone has said the Declaration of Independence is the birth certificate of the country. And I happen to have a copy of it in front of me, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but we have to understand where our form of government came from, where our laws came from. If we don't understand that, then none of the rest of the conversation makes a whole lot of sense. And we're talking about this dilemma between what is lawful and what is unlawful. It has to be based on the founding documents, and I absolutely agree with you, Dale, that people need to sit down and read the writings of the founders, because there's where the intent is discussed at length, as opposed to just trying to read the document itself, which is a little bit difficult reading and understand that. But there are a few fundamental principles that undergird, starting with the Declaration of Independence, undergird our Constitution and therefore all of our laws and therefore all of our rights and privileges and all of those things. And if we come back to the oath of office for the law enforcement officer and for a lot of other offices, the words that say something like uphold the Constitution and the laws of. Okay. So we're going to take a break here in just a minute, but I'd like to come back and address that a little bit further, because right there is a conflict.
Trigger Control Training is your premier firearms training group. Trigger Control's instructors combine the training experience from current law enforcement officers, military personnel, and the civilian training market. We understand that today may be the day, and we must have a survivor's mindset. Trigger Control understands firearms are not the only answer, but a tool for your personal protection toolbox. From carbine to car training, from handgun to pepper spray, from taser to law enforcement training, Trigger Control is your training partner who understands what it's about. A lifetime of training to survive 6 seconds. Call us today at 208-758-0543 or find us online at triggercontroltraining.com.
What to do, when to do it, and most importantly, how to do it. The Bailout Hour.
Hey, welcome back to the Bailout Hour. I'm Dale Fruit. I'm here with William Paul and Ed Wolf. And before the break, we were talking about the war of words. And I want to go back really quick to understand, why are we talking about this? Why is this so relevant to modern day affairs? And let me just paint you a little scenario. If you're pulled over by a law enforcement officer and you really don't know what the rules of engagement are, nor does he, the propensity for that to end up in a conflict or a violent ending is high. So just imagine this: if you both understood the exact rules of how this pullover was going to go, and you both were in complete agreement as to what the laws were in this interaction, everything would go very, very smoothly, assuming you were a ethical citizen. But what has happened is the people have absolutely no idea what the law is, and to be truthful, the cops don't either, because there are so many federal laws and laws on the books. The question is, who is enforcing these, and which laws is he enforcing and which one is he isn't, either by ignorance or just by department mandate. So what we're doing is we're backing up and looking at all of these contracts, all of these oaths, all of these the supreme law of the land, the Constitution. And before the break, Ed was talking about the Constitution, the founding documents that went into that, and why a study of that is so important. So we're going to head that back off to Ed and let him continue on with that thought.
Okay, thank you, Dale. As I mentioned, I have a copy of the Declaration of Independence in front of me, and if we have to understand some of the language, and I will read one sentence here that I think everybody has heard many times before, but what does it mean? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, we could take that sentence and probably spend the next couple of broadcasts dissecting that. But therein is the foundational document that guides everything we do today, and it directly influences the issue of what does the Constitution say, what does the law say, and are they in conflict? So to be simplistic, we can look back at that and look at any law at all, and say, does it meet the criteria of that sentence? Agreement? Disagreement?
Agree with you 100%. And when you say, it doesn't matter if you're an anti-theist, an atheist, an agnostic, a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, or you worship Star Trek, it's completely irrelevant. If you look at that phrase, I believe Thomas Jefferson penned that specific phrase. He had some co-authorship in that, but I think that's all his. Was are self-evident and endowed to us by a creator. Now, if you accept the Constitution and you accept that document, and by living here and being a citizen here, you by default you do, it was endowed to you by a creator. And I think the reason that is so important, again, regardless of your religious affiliations, then you tell me, does any living, breathing human being have the authority by law to compromise any of those mandates? Liberty of pursuit of happiness. Do they? No. And the moment they do, they are exercising, by definition, they're tyrannical. They're going outside of their authority. And that applies to the most common pullover to all the way through your federal government. If somebody goes outside of that, they're outside of their oath, because they're not abiding by the rule, the supreme law of the land, which is the Constitution. And I think that one single word in there, these are endowed to us by our Creator, it puts all of government in its place. There is God, or there is a Creator, and these rights are self-evident, and any government body, or any human being that tries to usurp those is doing so outside of his authority.
Now, there are folks who disagree with that, and I think that's actually a lot of contemporary thinking that says, well, that's really not the case, that everyone is sort of a god unto himself, a power unto himself, and my opinion is just as good as your opinion, and somehow we have to figure out how to agree and all get along. Now, that may sound ludicrous on the surface, but that thinking is behind a lot of what goes on in society today. For example, the law says that you can't possess or use certain kinds of drugs, as an example. And yet folks say, well, look, that doesn't apply to me because I'm a free individual, and this is a victimless crime, so to speak, so I can use whatever drugs I want to and to make myself feel good or whatever reason I use it, and you can't tell me I cannot. And we tend to buy into that. But that's a little bit of an aside, but that's an issue of today that is drastically affecting everything we're talking about here.
And to the good and to the bad.
To the good and to the bad, right.
And I would say it's important that we, as you talked about in the Declaration of Independence, we're talking about what is that oath, what is that responsibility of the person that's taking on that oath of office. It's the congressman, it's the senator, it's the police officer, and it's in that that's why we're having this discussion. Where is that oath in reference to everything we're talking about? And it's that war on words where it starts to convolute what we've actually started as a country with the intent behind it, to the case law possibly leading us down the wrong path, and then the people not objecting laws, which today is causing all the stink.
Right, and now let's, and I certainly agree with that. Let's go to the next sentence that I read because it applies here. It says, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. One of the single biggest issues that we have today is regulation that's not based on law. It's called administrative rulemaking, and every government agency at every level comes up with all kinds of rules and whatnot, mandates that really are not at the consent of the government. And I mean, in my past experience working for both state and federal government, that's very common. So the law of the land as we think it is really not. It's most of the laws and rules that we are forced to live by are made administratively. And so is that with the consent of the governed? No, it's not. And what is the other thing the federal government uses to enforce these various regulations? For example, just take one, EPA regulations. So what does the government use to enforce those?
A regulatory body?
They're a regulatory body, but they use funding.
Right.
So because the states and even the localities are dependent on federal funding, the federal government says, well, here's some rules. You don't have to live by them, but we're going to withdraw your federal funding if you don't.
So it's a bribe.
This is a hot issue. This is a hot issue in schools these days. Federal educational standards. Now, you don't have to live by these, but we're not going to send you any money if you don't. That's what I'm getting at.
No doubt.
Is that the consent of the government?
We're not going to give you We're not going to give Washington State $30 million for their highways unless they reduce their maximum speed limit to 65 miles an hour. That's a common occurrence. Back to your legislation thing, but we do live in a representative republic. We elect those representatives to go in to Olympia or into Washington, D.C. and execute the will of the people. So if those people are doing things that are not constitutional, the remedy for that is to vote them out. But how are you supposed to do that when 90% of the electorate, forget the 50% that don't vote, they're just dead weight, okay? The 50% that do vote, 90% of them have absolutely no idea that the legislatures are drafting and implementing law that are completely contrary to their security, safety, and the pursuit of happiness. And where this becomes really relevant is when you've got good officers that put on a badge are forced, they're not, but they think they have an obligation to take these quote-unquote laws and execute them because that's what they're supposed to do. This whole thing is a multi-pronged mess, and we all have ownership in it. This is absolutely not just the legislature. It's not just the cops. It's not the people. What we alluded to earlier is we are in a room, and it's locked. There's no ventilation, and just someone threw in a canister of tear gas. Now what?
Good times. I'm just teasing. All right, so I just want to add also, it's important that we understand, we're talking about the oath of office, okay? We're talking about the Declaration of Independence, and we're talking about intent, case law, and the written law, okay? And we're talking about also discretion on the officer and their ability to do certain things, the obligation of the people, and the resistance, okay? But we got to talk about one more little fundamental thing here, which is how does law get transmitted down? Okay, so you have the federal, applies to all bodies within the United States, okay? So Constitution applies to everybody within the United States. How does state law work? Well, the state law, okay, the states themselves, they can either, they can either, let me think about this just for a second so I can say it right. The state can only write laws which either afford more liberty to the citizens, okay, or further protect by defining it more narrowly, but they cannot pass laws which restrict any of those protected laws under the federal Constitution. And that is when people allow those laws for security and safety to get passed. So if the big one right now is still the gun deal, okay? I mean, obviously the PBS poll says that it's not a big deal. They know that they want to have guns to keep themselves safe, okay? But the government still has stuff on the books waiting for an opportunity for the next big tragedy to use it as an excuse to push down some new assault weapons ban, right? And so why are they even having a discussion about it? Because if you think about it, the right to bear arms, the intent was that the citizenry of the United States will be able to bear arms, which was defined as any military destructive device. Well, it's already been restricted under the NFA Act. So how are we even talking about this more? It's kind of a moot point. But even so, say the government goes and say there's no protection over ammunition. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that. But could you not imply that if you restrict ammunitions, now you've infringed on my Second Amendment right? Right? Is that see what I'm saying? We need to understand as individuals that law is not written to keep you safe or protect you. Okay, the role of a peace officer and those elected officials, when they take that oath of office, they're swearing to serve the Constitution, okay, the legal laws, and when they allow other laws to go through their state, okay, that is what they need to keep in mind.
Thomas Jefferson just exhumed himself from his grave, came up, walked into our room, and he's here right now, and he has a couple words. This is so strange.
That's right, the Constitution has something to say. Sit down and listen.
The Constitution of the United States was drafted to take the government, gag them, handcuff them, throw them in the corner, and say, you will do exactly what we the people say. The Constitution was drafted to confine and restrict all of the power that any government that we put out in. And I think what now we're starting to look at it is all of these laws and all of this legislature is seeing how can we put the people as a body into a squeeze chute so that they slowly get into the single file line and into the back of the slaughter truck as efficiently as we can. That is not what any of this law is supposed to be. The law is supposed to restrict the government, first and foremost. That's where it all starts. So anytime you see a law, it doesn't matter what it is, it's like, well, wait a minute. The nature of government is to try to buck that system. They're always trying to find a way of leaking out to the point where you take the Second Amendment, you start to put an unfair usury tax on ammunition. Well, why are you doing that? Why is ammunition taxed at 200%? Well, it has nothing to do with anything other than a government doing exactly what it is supposed to do. The nature of it is to try to break out of its confined box and execute its will on an ignorant people. It's doing a very good job of it. That's one side of the aisle. The other side of the aisle is the people are supposed to learn how to read. Top to bottom, left to right, you put letters together to form words. That's how to Tommy boy. But no, that's exactly it. We are not reading and studying and holding our government accountable. And yeah,
Well, now let me add something else here then, because we're toying with something here that we really haven't said. But at what point do we, the people, say enough is enough? Now, we talk about all the mechanisms that are in place, the elections. We can elect people that think the way we do. That's generally what we do. We try to vote for the guy or gal who agrees with us. And that process is all in place, but it seems, though, that the juggernaut of government continues full speed ahead.
Yeah, the agendas don't change from year to year.
Well, it doesn't. And again, I want to get back to what I said a minute ago by administrative rulemaking. It's the bureaucrats that actually run the government, not the government. You have to understand that, because they survive administrations. They survive for years. And so each administration adds to the bureaucracy, but it's the bureaucracy that's really out of control. So how do we, the people, stop that? Now, let's again go back to the Declaration of Independence. And I read just a line here. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And then they list, there's 2 whole pages of things that they said, this is the problem.
These are the grievances.
These are grievances, okay. So what was the result of the Declaration of Independence? Was, in fact, it ended up in a war, but how would you classify the action of those who signed the Declaration of Independence?
They were traitors. They were treasonous traitors.
They were treasonous. They were
According
treasonous.
to who?
What? According to the laws of the land. I mean, according to the laws of Great Britain, of the king, they were treasonous. Absolutely. So, but they were willing to do that. Now we're getting into a subject here that is really, really tricky these days. But these words are starting to get thrown around. Are we reaching a point, and the term is intolerable tyranny? Are we reaching a point in the United States of America where we are approaching intolerable tyranny? If so, what are our options? Go back to the Constitution. What does the Constitution say about that very subject, and what does the Constitution and the opinions of the framers, if you read their writings, what do they say about that very subject?
Maybe perhaps the difference is this. Can you imagine going back to 1775 and you and your wife and your 2 kids have neighbors, and together you go in a garden plot? They're gonna raise the cattle and the goats, and you're gonna try to get a garden going, and it's not too successful. But you're living together. You're relating to one another. You go into maybe you go into Boston and you procure some goods that are being given to you by the king, or being shipped over across the channel to the water to the colonies, and you're living this way, and all of a sudden the king is doing things that you don't like. The Stamp Act, the writ of assistance, the Stamp Act, where all of your official documents have to have the seal of the king. Well, why did he do that? He didn't do that because he wanted his seal on the papers. He wanted it so he could go in and prosecute people, just normal people, doing things that he thought were counter to his vision. How did he execute that? He passed the Parliament in Britain passed the writ of assistance. The writ of assistance gave law enforcement officers, armed law enforcement officers, the right to knock on your door. I have a search warrant. I wrote it right here on your porch. Let me in. Now I can legally go in and see if you're in compliance with the Stamp Act. What was that all about? It had nothing to do with the Stamp Act. Guess what was confiscated? Muskets, balls, and powder. And how is that relevant now? If you look at the Patriot Act and if you look at the NDAA, I would challenge you to put that up against the Stamp Act and the writ of assistance, and you will not see 1 degree of separation. Not at all. So that is why this is so important. I think we're being brought to a slow boil, and the difference between the colonies of 1775 and today are so similar. It's shocking. We're kind of running out of time here. I'm going to pass this over to William Paul.
I just want to point out, because we brought it up, what would we call our founding fathers? And the word was tyrants. Or no, the people over them were tyrants, but we called them treasonous.
Treasonous, traitors.
Then
yes.
I would like to say that is not what I feel they are, but that would be, by the definition, what they would be considered to their king, their emperor at the time. They're actually heroes for what they did. And the reason I say that is that they had absolute courage, because the people that signed the Declaration of Independence were not poor. They were wealthy. They had homes, they had plantations, they had businesses, they were successful, they were powerful people of the community, they were educated, and then they put everything on the line, okay, including their sacred honor, which is in the last article. And I think that, we need to pay tribute to that. And what it says here, at the very end of it, we mutually pledge each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And it's imperative, okay? They had everything to lose to include their life for what they believed in. And then one last closing thought, and I got this from a speech from Paul Harvey, Freedom to Change, and that was back in 1965, okay? He said, when he was talking about the Declaration of Independence, and he said this exact same thing, that the U.S. Revolution was different than any other one prior because of the very nature of the people who started it. It was the wealthy. It was the educated. It was people that had things to lose. They weren't already at the bottom. They were at the top of their community, and they said, you know what? It's time to hit the reset. This is BS. All right, this is the Bailout Hour. I am William Paul with Dale Fruit and Ed Wolf. Come back to us.
Anarchy is an independently produced film series made in Spokane, Washington by the award-winning Irvin Studios. Anarchy takes place 9 years after the fall of the American Empire. The primary characters in Anarchy consider past governments, past currencies, and the most influential philosophical thinkers in Western civilization as they work to build a new society that maximizes liberty and minimizes tyranny. You can see the series at facebook.com/Anarchy the series. You can also find us on YouTube using keywords Anarchy and Irvin Studios. That's ERVIN Studios.
Welcome back to the Bailout Hour. I'm Ed Wolf. I'm with William Paul and Dale Fruit. And before the break, we were talking about the issue of what is constitutional, and we had brought up the word treason. What is treasonous? And we referred back to the Declaration of Independence, which was by law, that is the law of England, a treasonous act. And yet we refer to our own Constitution and the writings of the founders where they said very, very plainly that if we end up in a situation in the United States, in our form of government, where tyranny becomes intolerable, we have a right to overthrow that government. Now, those two are directly in conflict because federal law says to advocate overthrow of the government is treason, and that can be punishable by death. And I want to assure the listeners we're not advocating the overthrow of the government, but we're trying to bring up some very important issues here to understand the language that we use today and understand what the Constitution actually says and what is our responsibility to uphold that Constitution. So in light of that, I wanted to find just a couple of words. Remember, we've been talking about the war of words. What do words actually mean? As someone said, words have meaning. And a quote from Dennis Miller that some of you probably have heard. Dennis says, when we start abusing the language, words stop having any meaning. And I'll give you an example. Question, what is a fundamentalist or fundamentalism? That has become a bad word. Fundamentalist is sometimes, they're called radicals, they're called terrorists, they're called all sorts of things. That's totally untrue. A fundamentalist is simply someone who believes in the fundamental principles of something or strict adherence to a basic set of ideas and principles. So what is a constitutionalist? That word is thrown around a lot today. A constitutionalist is nothing more than a fundamentalist, i.e., I believe the Constitution as it is written. That's all that means. And so I would think that should be a compliment to say I'm a constitutionalist. I believe the Constitution the way it's written. We believe that. I think those of us sitting at the table here
I
today
wouldn't disagree with that at all.
like I say, we would agree with that. Now, we hear the term radical used a great deal, and radical and terrorist and fundamentalist are all sort of put together into the same grouping. Well, the term radical means essentially something that is extreme, or it's a wide departure from the norm. So let's take the word radical extremist. We hear that a lot. What does that mean? That's virtually a meaningless term, because the way it's defined is that, and this obviously has to do with what we're calling radical Islam, but what does that actually mean? I think the important thing here to understand is that if we believe in basic principles, and we're talking, and let me just use an illustration here, and I think it will help clarify this a little bit. The subject of abortion is a certainly one that is a pretty hot topic, but people who support pro-life, that we call them pro-life people that don't believe in abortion, they would be by definition fundamentalists, and they go back to the Bible and they say the Bible says life is sacred, et cetera. We understand that. And so they are believing a fundamental truth the way that they see it. But if someone decides that they call themselves a Christian and they go out and they shoot an abortion doctor, what does that say about the other folks who believe that abortion is a sin according to the Bible? In modern terminology, those people are all lumped together. So all fundamentalists are terrorists, they're radicals, they're clear off the deep end, and that is completely untrue. So we have to be careful when we come back to this issue of what is a constitutionalist, what constitutes treason. We've got to understand what those words mean. Our position here is we believe the Constitution the way it is written, just like a fundamental Christian believes the Bible the way it is written, and we won't get into any more of that. But we have to understand the words that we're using here.
Right. I mean, and I think that's even an argument today is the Constitution an old, outdated document which is not even relevant today? Or, another argument I've heard is it's a living document. It was designed to kind of go with the flow of where we at today. And I don't know if we tried to use that in law. Oh yeah, it's just a document that just evolves over time, and the original one was not even relevant today. It seems like it would be eventually counter to itself. And I feel that maybe that's where we actually ended up, is we've allowed that ideology to kind of creep its way in the 1900s there and kind of, influence our policies and laws that were written and go on. So where does that authority even derive? I mean, I think that really brings in the bigger issue.
I think it is a living, breathing document, but the problem is, and I'm just going to throw this out, and I don't mean to make a false dichotomy here, but as a rule, the people on the left will say it is a living, breathing document. It's supposed to be changed. Terrific. But the moment you say that, you have an obligation to the listener to explain to me specifically what your grievance is with the original document. And if you haven't read it, and you don't understand it, and you don't know how we've deviated from it, it's kind of similar to the whole topic of capitalism. Well, capitalism, look at what it's done to people. We haven't seen capitalism in our lifetime. We haven't seen capitalism since the late 1800s. You wouldn't even recognize what actual capitalism is. We have deviated so far from that. So to throw out the Constitution and say, well, it's archaic, it's old. Okay, I appreciate that because you're bringing that to the table, but you have to back up that position and tell me why the original document is not suiting our current needs, and you're going to be left wanting every single time that argument's brought up. My opinion.
Yeah, and I it's from what I've gathered, generally those are progressive, organizations which are actually pushing that idea. And the progressive agenda then is not connected to constitutional beliefs at all. They're actually more in line with communistic and socialistic ideologies, which want to direct more power to the government and say, the government will keep you safe. The government will give you jobs, and I think that's the ideology where that is come in. And then because of media's propaganda, where they continually repeat things over and over and over, it's not a document that is holds value today. It's this living document that's changing, and it doesn't hold relevance today. It's too old, and that just got repeated. And at some point, it influenced individuals in positions that could make decisions. And so we ended up in that where we are today. And in addition, I think it's important. I mean, we've also been warned by 1984, H.G. Wells. He talked about the meaning of words, in essence, through newspeak. When he talked about newspeak, it's a fictional language that he wrote within the novel, and it is contributed language created by the totalitarian state within the book that's defined, Big Brother, to limit the freedom of thought and the concepts that pose a greater threat to the regime, such as freedom, self-expression, individuality, and just the general state of peace, because they had hate speech time, so you had to sit down, watch the TV, get all amped up on some hate. And any form of thought which was alternative to the party's construction to be classified as thought crime. And I think it's important that we are aware of, that was a novel which was completely fictional and obviously not real, didn't occur. But I think that we're looking at a very similar thing. I may mention, the federal government has the ability to build a list of books that should be burned, and they actually, according to law, have the authority to do that.
This is not a new issue at all. This war of words this is an ancient deal. If you look at the Trial of Socrates, which is an amazingly good read, and it's applicable to right now. If you look at René Descartes' treatise on I think, therefore I am, his whole argument. Can he prove his own existence? If you look at that and slowly read that, what happened from 2,000 years ago to now is contrary opinions were encouraged back then. As a thinker who was trying to seek the truth, was thinking, and he would share his ideas, he encouraged people that came up with contrary opinions because he knew he was either going to be beaten, which would sharpen his sword, or he would defeat that attack and have a little bit more conviction in what he's currently thinking. And you proceed with every single thought that way. That is very much like the way our original documents were drafted, was through a lot of debate.
And what I want to bring up is we're talking about what do words mean, okay? And you may not even be privy to all of the information to the definition of a word. So I'm going to give you guys an example. Okay, according to the MIAC report, MIAC is Missouri's Information Analysis Center, and it was a report put out for the Modern Militia Movement Report. Okay, and this came out, actually, it didn't come out. I'm going to correct myself on that. It was actually leaked into public knowledge in 2009. And the report basically detailed the trends in militia and terrorist activity within Missouri and described common symbols and media associated with militia members and domestic terrorists. Okay, this was disseminated all the way down to Highway Patrol. Okay, so local police officers were given this report. And it's important that you understand this and that you take a close look at the MIAC report. And I challenge you to go onto Google, just type in MIAC report, go to images, or the second link down, I think, is going to be your PDF. And it talks about some of the things. Now, maybe some of the things on there might have some legitimacy, but I find it most entertaining to go all the way to page 7. And when you look at the militia symbols, what you'll find is the Gadsden flag, which is the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, the coiled snake. How about a American flag, or the saying "Molon Labe," an upside down flag, Liberty flags. Okay, bumper stickers, which are associated to Representative Ron Paul, or Zeitgeist. Those are all symbols of a domestic terrorist. So if you put an American flag outside your house, guess what? By classification, according to the MIAC report, back in 2009, you could be associated to a domestic terrorist or be one. And that's even more relevant because those definitions do hold clout today, even though you may not think so. As we mentioned before, the National Defense and Authorization Act, okay, allows military operation within the United States and allows organizations, mainly the federal agencies operating within, to illegally detain. I'm going to use illegally. I'm just going to say detain, according to the document, detain somebody indefinitely. Okay, that means that there's no trial, there's no Miranda, there's no due process, as we understand it according to the legal system today, because you can be associated to a domestic terrorist.
Remember, those laws, remember that these laws are drafted and they sit on a piece of paper on a table. Those laws don't do anything. They don't execute evil. They're not anything. They sit there on a table with no power whatsoever. In order for that to be evil, you have to have somebody that is willing to grab a gun, put on a uniform, put on a badge, and execute that law because it's my job.
So why is the law there then? Ask that question. What was the intent of the writers when they wrote that law?
The legislature?
Yes. Whoever wrote that. What was their intent?
We know it was in a vacuum devoid of the Constitution. We know that there's no you can't argue that. The intent, well, that could be summed up a bunch of different ways. I believe the intent of this all goes down to the very founding of what the dollar is and the nature of the dollar. The only way you can live in this economy in the United States is to constantly be borrowing money. And the only way you can continually borrow money is through a police state and through a war state. And that gives us the ability to go to the Treasury, borrow more money, and keep our economy floating by inventing problems.
I would say it's not the intent, it's the excuse to keep the people safe from this fearful enemy, the domestic terrorist. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick break. This is the Bailout Hour. You're joined with William Paul, Ed Wolf, and Dale Fruit. You guys stay tuned. We got more coming on the end of this break.
Uber Fire is a survival product originally designed for downed U.S. air crews to assist them in building a fire when they were seriously injured and when all of the surrounding carbon-based fuels are saturated. Uber Fire has been tested, vetted, and approved by several of the most elite military and law enforcement teams in America. It has been tested all over the world and in the harshest environments. Visit our Uber Fire website at theuberfire.com. That's theuberfire.com. There you'll find a comprehensive video outlining what Uber Fire is, how it's used, and how to acquire Uber Fire for your personal use.
Welcome to the Bailout Hour. I'm William Paul, joined with Dale Fruit and Ed Wolf. We're sitting here, we're talking about the war of words, and I want to welcome you to 1984. So that's where we are. We're challenging you to be a critical thinker, to not be complacent in what you hear, and even what we're saying, okay? We want you to be an educated individual, okay, and understand what you're hearing, because sometimes we allow words to go by unchallenged. And when we do that, we allow ourselves to be subject to somebody else's agenda or the propaganda, which may be relayed or laid over often. So let's not do that, and let's pick up where we left off here with this concept of the war of words.
Okay, thank you, William. When we talk about words have meaning and how we're changing words, I'm glad you brought up the book 1984, one of my favorite books. And what happened there was the government began to redefine speech for their own political purposes. Is that happening today? I think the obvious answer is yes. We call it political correctness, PC speech, where words are changed to mean something different than their actual definitions to suit somebody's agenda. That's pretty broad and general, but that's what politically correct speech is. We can say certain things, we can't say certain things, and the meanings of those words are redefined. We use the term domestic terrorist. We talked about what that is by definition of this particular paper that William was reading from. What does domestic terrorist actually mean? And we can save that for another time. But I can assure you, at least in my opinion, we are at 1984. We are redefining the speech, redefining the language. We call it political correctness, all for some purpose that perhaps we can discuss that further. But I think the listener certainly understands that it's leading us in a direction.
And it's difficult to deny. Not only is the words and the political correctness movement, which took fodder and is run, and now we've restricted what we can say, and because the words have taken on new meaning. But in addition, now you have some teeth coming with it. Now you have, when you're associated to these words or those type of things, there's legislation, the NDEA, the Patriot Act, which now make you criminal under federal law.
Okay, and you're absolutely right. Let me give you just one example. The word hater or hate speech. Now, you can define that however you wish, but the real danger when we start changing the meaning of words is when they become codified. That is, when they become law. And that particular term has been proposed in a variety of different laws. So who's going to define what hate speech is? It's not going to be you and it's not going to be me, but somebody who writes the legislation will define what that is. And that then will become law, will be enforceable. And in some countries, even today, you can go to jail for saying certain things. So that's coming. The other point I wanted to make, just to wrap up, was we're at 1984, but are we at 1772 as well? Are we reaching a point of intolerable tyranny in this country, in our government? My personal opinion is we're not there yet, but we seem to be moving in that direction.
I'd offer something. I don't think we're at 1984, and I don't think we're at 1972. I think we're considerably beyond that.
1772.
What did I say?
1972.
Oh, yeah,
that's
well,
fine.
1772. Richard Nixon wasn't that bad.
That's right.
So I would say we're not, and the reason we're not is because of an apathetic, sound asleep populace. I think George Orwell and I think our founding fathers grossly underestimated what apathy would do to a republic. I think where we're at right now is we are the British troops on the other side of the Delaware, sound asleep, complacent with this hubris that we are a military that's never been defeated. We're so good, there's no way these peasants with muskets could ever get us because we've cut off their supply line. Guess what? You're about to get smoked by a superior force. We need to wake, and that's what all this is about. If you think, we've mentioned the word traitor and tyranny and all that stuff. If you think we're a fringe group, we're not. All three of us sitting at this table have sworn an oath, and we mean it. To the end of our lives, we mean that. And we'll have this conversation with federal judges. We'll have it at the dinner table. We'll have it with somebody at a coffee shop, a cop. It doesn't matter. We are very proud of the fact that we're not sticking our finger in our chest of any one group. We are patriots trying to get back to the table, defining terms, understanding what the rule of law is so that we can solve this by peace. Ed mentioned earlier that nobody here is out to overthrow the government. Well, I completely disagree. I have a case against the United States government that is watertight, can't be argued. The question is, are we sitting there with AK-47s flying the Confederate flag driving down the street? Absolutely not. We want this solved peacefully, and it can totally happen if we sit down at the table and have a rational discussion. That's the way this can go. And if you're an ostrich, you stick your head in the sand and you say everything's fine, I promise you this is going to end in violence. Every time this happens in world history, a government becomes big, powerful, starts to exercise its tyranny, it ends in violence. I think the patriot today says we're better than that. We're going to get back to the original intent, the rule of law, have a conversation between ourselves, our police departments, our federal law, our legislatures, and ultimately the federal government, and we're going to solve this peacefully. That's the only way I can think we can ethically get to the end of this. So that's the way I'd like to round up this particular podcast.
And you actually make an excellent point there, because our Constitution allows for that process to happen legally. And I think that's where our emphasis has to be. The Constitution does permit that, and there's mechanisms to do that, to replace a tyrannical government.
And if you want to know what a tyrant looks like, a tyrant is somebody that says this speech is unlawful, and I'm going to arrest you for it. You are looking at a living, breathing, armed tyrant. That's what one looks like.
I think it's important that as individuals that you don't live in fear, okay? You can't allow fear to control you. Fear forces you to react. And really right now is not the time to react. It's the time to act. And there's a difference, okay? When you take action, okay, it's an actionable contingency to a threat. You're going to take action. You're going to act on the moment. It means that you know what you're doing, it's deliberate, and it's decided, and it's pre-decided. It means that you've already made a decision, okay? The writing's on the wall. You have questions. You want to find out. It's time to go find out for yourself. Do you live in a police state? Who are your policemen? Go talk to your local agencies and do a ride-along. Get to know your policemen. Get to know your elected officials. Go to city council meetings. It is imperative that we stop becoming complacent, okay? Because if you continue to live a complacent life and you don't take the time for the things that actually matter, which is your future and the generations which follow, your children and their children, then you're going to end up in a situation where fear is going to be the state of affairs. And it could end up in a state of unrule. And we have an opportunity to make sure that we don't get there and we don't want to be there. Because in those type of situations, peace cannot exist. And without peace, there is no prosperity. Right now, we have an opportunity and an obligation as individual citizens to do what is necessary. It was outlined in our founding documents. They told you how to do it. So we need to do it. Okay, this is the Bailout Hour. Until next time, I'm William Paul, Dale Fruit, and Ed Wolf. God bless, and we'll see you next time.